Good evening. My name is Graham Virgo, and I'm the Senior Pro-Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cambridge, with particular responsibility for education. And education is very broadly defined at Cambridge, and one part of my portfolio is sport, which is something I really enjoy engaging with, sport at Cambridge in all sorts of different ways. And consequently, I'm delighted to be welcoming you to this event this evening, where we are going to be talking about the role that sport and exercise can play in rebooting Britain. And I'm delighted to welcome two Cambridge alumni, Matt Rogan and Kerry Potter, both from Fitzwilliam College, who are going to say a little bit about how they met and what they've done since they left Cambridge. But the trigger for what we are going to be talking about this evening is a book which has just been published. And if you look carefully at the screens of Matt and Kerry, you will see copies of this book. And I have my own copy here. It's not propped up behind me because I may be referring to it during this session. All to play for how sport can reboot our future. A book I have read and really enjoyed, really thought-provoking. And we're going to be talking about some of the issues coming out of this book. But first, I think it'll be really helpful for Matt and Kerry to introduce themselves to you and say a little bit about themselves and what they've done since Cambridge. So Matt, over to you. Do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Graham, and hi, everyone. My name's Matt Rogan. I was at Fitz between 93 and 97. I was a linguist. And ended up really focusing on German and German history, principally because at the end of my first year, my French professor told me I spoke French like a footballer. And that was in the era that David Beckham was in Paris Saint-Germain. So I thought that probably wasn't the best recommendation for my future prospects for French. And at that time, spent about half my time studying, and about half of it split between Oxford Road and Fenners, where I played football and tennis, and fell in love with the connection between my working world and sport, to the point that I really only ever wanted my working world to be sport. And after an initial stint in strategy consultancy, managed to make my way in that direction. So firstly at the NBA, the US Basketball League, and then MTV, funnily enough, in the music side of things, which were all entertainment one way or another, as I'm sure we'll come on to. And ultimately set my own business up way back when in 2011 with my wife, which was an interesting experience, working for 9 years, very closely with my wife, Claire, also a Fitzwilliam graduate, and a good mate. And we built a business called Two Circles, which worked with the likes of the IOC and UEFA and FIFA and Liverpool and Chelsea and all sorts of different teams and organizations, just helping them make sense of the data they hold in their organizations and use that to their commercial and general advantage. A little bit like the club card you get at Tesco helps Tesco understand where to put the beans or when to launch a new shop. So that's been what my world has traditionally contained. And as unfortunately the pandemic was breaking on us in March 2020, I was stepping back from that role, as my wife Claire also was, wondering what to do with my time, which is where the book story begins. But at that point, I should probably hand over to Kerry. And we met at university, at Fitz, spent a lot of time together on a football pitch, but I'll hand her that curveball and then she can update from there.
Yes.
Kerry.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm Kerry Potter. As Matt said, we were at college together. So I was at Fitz from 93 to 96, and I read English, although I spent quite a lot of time in the nightclubs and bars of Cambridge at the time. And then some time on the football pitch as well. So I played for I played it. There were 2 women's teams, weren't there? I think, Matt, and I played in one of those. And I think Matt coached us for a while, but I was not exactly that good at football. And I used to, sort of, we'd go for a night out and then fall onto the football pitch the next morning. And we didn't take it very seriously, but it was very sociable, and I have really happy memories of that, and have never been able to play football since, actually, because it just wasn't a thing that I found I could do in my early 20s back then. Obviously things have changed a lot now for women's football and how accessible it is. So anyway, I read English for 3 years, and then I went on to train as a features journalist, and journalism is what I've been doing ever since. I always wanted to be a writer, for as long as I can remember, and that's what I do. I write stories. I meet lots of very interesting people, some of them sports people, and I've worked for lots of different magazines and newspapers along the way. I was a music journalist for a while on a music magazine. I was on a fashion magazine for a while. I write lots about health and fitness, which is where Matt and I kind of intersect. And my current job is I'm associate features editor on the Evening Standard in London. So I'm just interested in people and people's stories, and I write about lots and lots of different types of things. But Matt has kind of focused my mind, and we joined up to do the book together. And that's been a very interesting experience, which I'm sure we'll tell you a bit more about.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So I am going to talk to you about the book and ask you some questions about the book. We'll be having this conversation for about 25 minutes, and then there will be a chance for those of you listening to ask questions. So if you have questions prompted by anything we say over the next 25 minutes, please do put them in the Q&A box in Zoom, and we will try and answer as many of the questions as we can. We may not have time to answer them all, but I do want to ask you about the book, All to Play For. So Matt, why actually did you write the book?
So I guess it definitely coincided with taking a step back from my 6 days a week job that was at the business that I'd set up, and I didn't feel when I was leaving the business that I was moving away from something. I felt like I was moving towards something, and it was just a sense that sport was at a tipping point of realizing some of the things I'd believed that I always thought it was capable of. So rather than just being a mechanism that could distract us from what else we had going on in the rest of our lives for a couple of hours at a weekend, or something that we could watch on the television when we collapsed after a day at work to watch lots of coloured dots wander around on a bit of green in front of our eyes, that actually we'd been, in Britain in particular, missing the big opportunity from sport. And that I felt that it was a real tipping point of achieving something really interesting, to say, not just, how does professional sport play a role in the consciousness of many people in this country, but also how is sport really beginning to play a role in terms of social cohesion, in particular for younger generations? How are younger generations starting to consume sport and exercise in a different way? Pre-COVID, we were at the tipping point of really understanding how sport and exercise can be used potently in healthcare, not just in terms of physical healthcare, maybe as a means of prevention rather than cure, but also in terms of mental health and mental support. Starting to understand, particularly through a role I play as a charity trustee, starting to understand the role that it can play in education, in helping people become more productive and happier in the way in which they learn, starting to rethink the way in which we plan our urban environments, so on and so forth. And I just was sort of at this point of thinking, there's all this stuff that I'm picking up around my various things that I do from a work perspective, and I want to share that more broadly. And I guess it was sort of at that point of saying, well, I have some time now, I have the ability to be able to pull that together and maybe tell some stories that people in other walks of life who don't have the luxury of working in sport might not necessarily have been able to be exposed to. At the same time, I was really conscious that my world is that little bubble of sports, And in order to tell those stories more broadly, I was going to need some help to dig me in the ribs and say, nobody apart from the 3,000 people who work in the industry in this country are going to have a clue what you're talking about. And so that's where kind of Kerry's expertise and friendship, frankly, really came in, which was have a relationship where she could tell me to get over myself or explain that in a different way. And frankly, also provide a female perspective to everything that I was trying to say.
So Kerry, why did you want to be involved in this book yourself?
I mean, this idea of kind of sport having a broader application beyond the industry, I was really interested in. And I mean, I think, you know, to be perfectly frank, that there was a sense of sort of timing in a personal way as well, because we started it at the beginning of the pandemic, didn't we, Matt? And yeah. Life was very uncertain. I mean, lots of my journalism work dried up overnight. Right. I mean, it was a tough time, and to have something, a really interesting topic that we were both passionate about, that we could sort of sit in obviously in our separate houses and focus on, it was actually a bit of a savior for me as well, actually, during that time. And you know, Matt and I both love running. Matt's a million times better at it than me, but we'd both go on our separate morning runs and have a think, and then we'd sort of, you know, chat in the day, and then we'd write. And it was, you know, it was a time when we were all thinking about sport and exercise in relation to health, obviously, as well, when people were so many people were dying and so many people were ill. And yeah, and there was an opportunity. I mean, we discussed very early on that we wanted to bring other voices into it. I thought that was really important. So I'm really proud of the range of interviewees we brought in, and some of them were from Matt's world. Some of them were, you know, I got the rock star Johnny Marr, who was in the Smiths, to talk about his love of running and kind of where hedonism meets exercise and that kind of thing. We just brought lots of different types of people. So I think we came at it from quite different angles, I think, didn't we, Matt? But I think it kind of works with both of our inputs.
Absolutely. So as I say, having read the book, you've got interviews with all these different people, loads of really interesting observations as well about sport today, and I want to pick up a few themes there. Matt, you do say at various occasions, it's quite clear when you were writing this, and you're referring to things that are about to happen, like the Tokyo Olympics, like the 100 in cricket. Yeah. And I just wonder where we are today at the end of the summer, bearing in mind the sporting events that have happened over the summer. So European football, Olympics, Paralympics, cricket, and tennis as well. Does that change any of your views that you've expressed in the book, or has it confirmed them?
I think it's probably confirmed them, and specifically, I think so. I say very clearly in the book that change is not only necessary for the way we view sport and exercise, but it's also an opportunity. And we talk about various things. So, for example, we talk about the opportunity of genuinely building sport in a way that is compelling for younger audiences and for women. And I haven't seen a better example of that ever, I don't think, than the 100, built from the ground up to be compelling to new audiences, and also to put female cricketers on center stage. I also think we talked about quite a lot of detail, and Kerry did fantastic interviews around sort of why now for athlete activism, and that notion of athletes being able to appear concurrently on the front page, the business pages, and the back page of sport. And I think we've seen through the course of the summer, whether it's the England football team led by Gareth Southgate, whether it's some athletes, frankly, forcing the IOC to step down in terms of trying to stop them having a political or a social view on the medal podium. I think we've seen that come to the fore as well. And I think, frankly, on the back of some of the things we were saying about athlete activism in tennis and the role of influential, strong female personalities in tennis, I must admit we definitely didn't predict the most strong female professional tennis voice and the biggest star this summer being an English qualifier winning the US Open. But you know, can't predict everything. But I think we weren't too far off with many of them. Kerry, got anything to add on that front? What have you seen this summer?
I mean, in terms of how this, I mean, I think obviously we've had this amazing summer of sport, haven't we? And it's really cut through to the mainstream as well. I did a big cover for the Evening Standard magazine, interviewing lots of the Olympic Team GB Olympic athletes, kind of headed up by Max Whitlock, and you know, everyone in my office, they're not particularly immersed in the world of sport, but everyone was really excited. The Euros, we obviously did so well, didn't we? And you know, even if it's Instagram accounts, you know, in honor of Jack Grealish's legs, or, you know, everyone who, whether they're interested in football or not, or just the vagaries of things like that, it just seemed to, you know, we wrote a lot about the kind of sport as a kind of collective ritual, one of the last remaining things that can bring people together. And watching sport, we do it, we all do it together. It's one of the things that one of the few things we don't watch on catch up or binge watch, or, you know, everyone's watching that one thing at the same time. And I think there's something really powerful in that. And I think coming out of the pandemic, it's been just such a brilliant thing, you know, it's been so joyful, hasn't it, this summer? And I think, God, we needed that, right? I think
it does take us back to, it gives us something that for myself personally, that I feel like I need, just to balance myself out, but also there's sort of the lens through which I reflect on a lot of the things going on in the world. So my sporting highlight, despite everything you mentioned, this summer would probably have been being stood at the start line of a park run the day the park run came back. And I've never felt so emotional at a sporting event since I was stood at the start line. I mentioned it in the book of the Boston Marathon that happened the year after the bombings, but being on the start line of park run this year, when the race director sort of, it makes me slightly emotional even thinking about it, the race director, volunteer of course, stood up at the front, just said welcome back, as a solitary tear went down the front of her face. And it just, there wasn't a dry eye in the front five rows of people running, which actually was a disaster, because it meant everyone started running really quick when they said go, and everyone was exhausted after about the first mile. But that was absolutely my sporting highlight. So not necessarily the professional side, but just that, and seeing my kids back to playing was pretty special.
But it's only when you get back into sport you realize how much you've missed it. Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, there are all sorts of themes, some really important themes in your book, and I want to pick up a few of them. One that really struck me was your analysis of the different generations and the way they are approaching sport and how that's changed over the time. So you focus on the baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, and Generation Z, which is the really interesting one. So those are the people born after 1997. I am just in Generation X. Knowing when you both matriculated, you are most definitely much more clearly in Generation X. But if you compare Generation X and Generation Z, so Generation X are people at Cambridge in the 1980s and 1990s. What are the big differences do you think in their approach to sport and to exercise?
So I guess maybe if I kick off and then throw to Kerry. So through the course of building Two Circles up over the last 10 years, it's been really interesting. We hired about 300 people, 300 sports nuts, and most of those post first degree.
Yeah.
And if I think about the kind of conversations that I had in the student bar at Fitz, which by that point tells you something. It was a bar, not a coffee shop. It's more of a coffee shop that happens to have a little bit of a bar, and that's not a moan, that's just the reality. We spent a lot of time talking about whether, and still do frankly, whether darts is a sport or snooker is a sport. And we did, that's quite interesting, but it was almost as if being a sport was a badge of honor. You know, and you were either a sport, and if you weren't a sport, you were just playing around, then people, it kind of didn't carry the same cachet. And what I noticed in in those people that two circles hide, in particular latterly, it is just that conversation didn't happen. Certainly wouldn't happen in my son's, who's now 14. You're more interested in the notion of, is it fun? Can I engage with my friends? Do I enjoy it? And sometimes, and therefore I am playing, and I might have my play through parkour. I might have my play through playing Fortnite. I might have my play through doing keepy uppies with the football, or I might play something that involves some rules. And any of those are perfectly valid ways to spend my time. So in that sense, sport has expanded, but it doesn't have that sort of slightly snobby construct of needing to be competitive, have a referee, have a winner and a loser. I think that's completely changed, and I think that's also true of the way in which even younger generations are starting to think about things as well. So my daughter's just 11. If I look at the way she engages with music in a very similar way to which she'll engage with sport. She'll flick on her phone and look at dancing, look at gymnastics simultaneously and see no distinction. I think that's the world in which we operate. I mean, Kerry's daughter actually is a gymnast, a very good one.
Yeah, she trains she's like sort of an elite gymnast, so it's been really interesting watching her journey. But I think you're right. I think you're right, Matt. Going back to the thing about the kind of there not being boundaries around what sport, I think that's part of a bigger generational shift, isn't it? With younger people, there are, for people of our age, you know, we find it quite surprising how few boundaries they have around lots of different things. I mean, look at the debate around gender and around flexible working. I mean, you can see it across the board, can't you, with Gen Z and millennials? They don't really care about boundaries or labeling things. They just kind of get on with it if they enjoy it, don't they? So I think that's part of it as well. Yeah.
I think what we notice at the other end of the spectrum is, so sports got looser and more informal at that a younger age. Flip side, at the older ages, as we become in the last 20 years, so boomers, my parents hate that particular word, but you know, my mum and dad are 72 and 74 and still play tennis, are currently involved in a virtual challenge, I guess, or with their my dad's sister who lives in Hawaii to cover the expanse of Hawaii over the course of a month, and just take that stuff as normal. And I think as healthcare has improved, people are able to stay active for longer. And what that's meant is sport has adapted there too. So if you look at development of things like walking football, right, and all sorts of formats, and frankly, there are more women aged 45 to 60 joining and starting to play walking football and football now than there were at the ages of sort of 10 to 25 when, you know, just 20 years ago. So sports needs to be able to morph to the younger ones, but it's adapting quite successfully to those at the other end of the spectrum.
So following on from that, bear in mind the real importance of it needing to develop and evolve, picking up the rebooting Britain aspect of sport and exercise. In what way do you think sport and exercise can reboot Britain? What impacts will it have?
It's probably, if we take specifically that generation we've been talking about, so the Gen Zs we've been talking about, it seems to me that actually my generation, said owning the problem, has dealt with pretty rough hands. So the students rolling through Cambridge now, and we called it the toxic alphabet in the book, I think. So austerity, Brexit, COVID and debt, and I haven't yet thought of any. But that's a pretty challenging environment in order to grow up. And it seems to me utterly unsurprising that if you look at that demographic, they're not particularly trusting of traditional authoritarian power, whether that's the media, whether that's business, whether that's NGOs. And against that context, trying to make sense of the hand they've been dealt. And so I think, and trying to say, well, actually, if I can't afford to live in a city, maybe some of those traditional jobs that have been open to me aren't as compelling as they might normally have done, because I'm not, it's going to be like an extension of my academics. Maybe if I can't work overseas as straightforwardly anymore, maybe I need to think differently about the life I build and get out of town. Maybe I need to think differently about the way I eat, on the basis of the fact that everyone older than me seems to be at the tipping point of diabetes. And so against that backdrop, I think sport has an opportunity to support them in all sorts of ways. The one I'd maybe touch on to start with would be the urban planning piece. So if you look at most of our cities in Britain right now, we have a lot of bars and a lot of, even towns, a lot of bars and a lot of retail estates, which increasingly is shops that are boarded up. And so for newer generations, we need to do a very good job of rethinking the role of a city and thinking about how sport and exercise can play a role in there that makes them compelling places for younger generations to want to live and work. Can't escape overseas anymore. So it's our responsibility to think differently about how we plan, because otherwise urban environments are going to become ghost towns when they can work at home.
There was we did an interview in the book with James Hope Gill, the guy who runs skateboarding, isn't it? And he was quite interesting, talking about thinking about using skateboarding as active travel. Obviously, we don't want people in their cars and whatnot, and it's that thing of making cities more accessible for making parks more accessible for skateboarders and that kind of thing. And rather than that sort of thing of older people often tutting when they see people skateboarding down the pavement, it's thinking about things like how to incorporate things that older people might not consider a sport, but younger people certainly do, and kind of support those kind of activities as well, I think, isn't it?
And so there are all sorts of impacts, I mean, health and urban planning, etc. There is a concern, particularly looking at Generation Z, that with all the pressures that you've identified, that they're not going to be attracted to sport or to exercise. Do you think that is a problem? And if so, what do we need to do about that?
I think I would say there's a chance that they won't be attracted to sport, but there's not a chance that they won't be attracted to exercise. And that's that distinction again between formal 11-a-side, let's say Saturday afternoon, need to commit for the whole year, spend every week, whether it's football, it's cricket, hockey, whatever it is, that sort of structured way to block out large parts of your leisure time doesn't always work for them, everyone apart from the keenest. However, if you look at alcohol consumption dramatically down, if the way in which they spend more time outdoors than earlier generations to get away from screens a lot of the time. If you look at, to Kerry's point, the fact that they're far more avid cyclists than previous generations would have been to commute, which is partially need because they can't afford to get our expensive public transport, and partly desire. And you look at climate change, frankly, as well as part of that, which is only going to have to move in one generation. I think I see in most of the data points them being just as avid in terms of exercise. The question is how active they'll be in terms of physical sport participation, which is why sport has to change and evolve to meet their needs. So cricket clubs can't offer one format of cricket, which is 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 9 o'clock at night every Saturday for the whole summer, and expect 21-year-olds to spend their summer doing that and that alone anymore. It has to change and evolve.
Thank you. Kerry, what do you think about, is there a need to encourage younger people to take up exercise, engage more with sport, or really what Matt's saying is the exercise piece is there, and maybe sport's different?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent it is, but there was some research published by Sport England today about levels of, it's always been a problem with teenage girls dropping out of sport, hasn't it? But I think the pandemic has exacerbated that, and they found that when girls got to 16 or 17, it just dropped off a cliff. Part of that is concerns around body image, which I think needs to be addressed. Fitness influencers on Instagram sometimes not be very helpful. That kind of thing. And so I think Sport England's new, because obviously they did the This Girl Can campaign, which was massively successful in getting more women and girls into, physical exercise, because there was a huge gap between the number of women and the number of men exercising, and that campaign, which everyone remembers, was so successful in showing the range of activities you can do, and you don't have to be brilliant at it, and you don't have to look a certain way. So I think that this is their next step on from that, is trying to work out how to bring those teenage girls back in, and they're finding that lots of the traditional sports teenage girls aren't that interested in, the kind of ones offered by, you know, when I was doing PE at school. So it's about sort of getting them to do dances that are on TikTok, getting them to do yoga. The Sport England are helping PE teachers reach those girls, because there is something for everyone out there. I mean, I didn't like PE much at school, to be honest. I went to a comprehensive school, which was great, but it didn't have the amazing sports facilities that some people have. And lots, when we were interviewing people for the book, Matt and I found that there were so many horror stories about PE coming up, weren't there, Matt? It seemed to be a common theme. People kind of say, God, I had a really hard time at school. Cross country was a punishment. I hated cross country at school. Now I literally do cross country. That's my only leisure. I run across fields on my own for fun. So, you know, there has to be something around the way we're teaching children as well, I would say.
So, Kerry, when I read that in the book, it brought back all the appalling memories of cross country for me, and I was totally put off by PE. And I'm taking up running now, largely because of the encouragement of the sports service at Cambridge. And actually at Cambridge, what you've been saying about the importance of exercise, we're really trying to push that, and it's get people to play sport, but think more widely about the benefits of exercise. Now, look, questions are coming in, and I do want to go to those in a minute, but I do want to just pick up the last part of the book, which is really interesting. It's your prophecies, predictions, and there's some really interesting pithy statements which I do want to pick up with you. I will throw one which did stand out. Parents will be seen and not heard. Discuss.
Yeah, so this one actually was inspired by well, firstly, my experience as a parent of kids who originally played tennis, and noticing the very austere, slightly jittery parents who hovered at the side of tennis courts while their offspring were playing tennis, thinking, well, I'm not sure the parents are enjoying this, and I'm pretty sure the kids aren't either. But then I had 2 or 3 conversations with kids sports coaches in and around the pandemic. And for those who are listening who had children, will remember there was this period there where the kids were allowed to play. You could drop your kids off and play football or play tennis or whatever their thing was, but the parents couldn't sit and watch. And I talked afterwards, these 3 coaches who had coached the kids in that environment, and they said, every single one said it was the most fun coaching they'd ever done, because the kids smiled. The kids never once looked over their shoulder to see what their parents thought about what they'd done. They took more risks, so they learned more quickly. And they said, you know what, if I could coach kids like that every day, I'd be here forever and a week. And so where that took me to was having conversations at the tennis club where I'm a trustee, where we now trying to keep parents out of any coaching, send them to the cafe to go and have a coffee and just get out of the way. And I think what we'll see is some of the more enlightened governing bodies, even though it's not going to be popular, just say, look, sorry, these various competitions through the course of the year are no parent zones. And it's going to be hard for the parents. But when the kids come out with a smile on their face, it's only the hardest parent, the most selfish parent that would say, that's not a good way for my kids to spend their time.
I think I'm totally in agreement with Matt on this. And I think it has to be the way forward. And as I mentioned, my daughter was competing at quite a high level in gymnastics. And so I've seen the pressure and a lot, you know, to be perfectly frank with you, a lot of the other mums, and it was generally the mums with gymnastics, would travel around the country to different arenas and they do these competitions. If those mums could be in a leotard themselves, they would be, you know, watch it. And you know, the kids are under so much pressure from the coaches anyway, and from their own expectations. I feel my job as a parent is not to add to that pressure, it's to support her or my son in his football. And I think also, I think as a parent, you've got to have a long, hard look at yourself. If you're getting that involved with your kids' sport, what's missing from your life? You know, maybe you need to go and do a sport, because that idea of living vicariously through your children's achievements, it's not great, is it? So I think it's all about support. And I think it's sort of, if you haven't got anything nice to say, don't say anything at all, because they don't need to feel that your love for them is conditional on them not letting a goal in or getting a gold medal or whatever. So I feel quite strongly about that, and I think parents need to pipe down, and I think that, like Matt says, it will make sport much more enjoyable for children.
Really interesting. And I have talked to people at Cambridge playing sport who say they're enjoying it more at university because they don't have parents breathing down their necks. Absolutely agreeing with what you've said. Okay, now we've got a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to jump around a bit because the first one is actually relevant to what we've just been talking about. Do you think it is ever too young for children to become seriously involved in sport and training?
Yes. So there is an increasing amount of very robust medical research that makes clear that until the sort of mid-teenage, so 14, 15, actually putting too much emphasis on one sport and one set of body movements is a very dangerous thing for kids in terms of the physical health problems that it can create down the road. And indeed, actually, that balanced sporting exposure to a number of different sports at a medium level is definitely the best way to succeed in the long term anyway, because of the strength it builds in your body. So if you look at Emma Raducanu, who's one example, was playing, I think, hockey, go-karting, doing a bit of cross country and all sorts of things up until a relatively late age. I also think, frankly, in particular now, we put so much pressure on our kids in so many ways, far more than Kerry and I ever had, whether we're doing SATs or whatever we're doing. And the peer pressure that goes around through social media and things is pretty scary. And so I think sport is one of those areas where if you're looking to build successful, happy adults at the age of 18, 19, 20 and beyond, that are physically able and mentally able, then we need to back off on the competition through the until sort of mid-teenage years.
Kerry, anything you want to add to that?
I think Matt's nailed it. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So a very different question. We're talking in this country a lot about levelling up at the moment, whatever levelling up means. What would be Matt and Kerry's number one priority now for exercise and sport as regards levelling up? Kerry, go on.
Can I just say something? Something I've been thinking about a lot as the nights draw in. You know, for so many women and girls, once it gets dark before work and after work, you feel like you cannot go out running or walking or cycling. And as we've seen horrible things going on in the press in the last week or so, you know, that fear is very real, and that threat can sometimes be very real for women. And it really makes me cross every winter at this time of year that my exercise regime is now completely curtailed by daylight hours. And I just think if there was one thing we could do to make exercise more accessible to 50% of the population, would be to make public spaces more accessible to women. So how realistic this is, I don't know, but you know, having places that are better lit, you know, just making it more, you know, making parks and roads and things like that just safer for women to exercise, and that would really level up accessibility, I think. And I think it's something that's not really often thought about, because I don't think it occurs to men. You know, your freedom isn't curtailed. You don't think, well, I won't go out because it's dark, generally, I think. So
I think that's it's really important, and part of access is frankly the one word with which I'd answer that question on a really macro level. It's all very well for us to say that, and we did in the book, that, you know, people were still allowed their 1 hour of exercise even in the most stringent times of lockdown. But to Kerry's point, if you're working during the day and you're scared of going out in the evenings, or your exercise is your local leisure centre that you pay your £4 for swimming, but that's shut, or your sports club that you as a junior kid go down and play a game at, that you rely on as the only way to play affordable sport in your local community at your youth club, is also shut, then the reality of the pandemic was it just exacerbated the social divides in participation in sport. And basically what happened was the fit got fitter and the fat got fatter. So we now find ourselves at a really acute point, not least because actually a lot of the leisure centres and the public facilities that were open pre-COVID, that are public-private partnerships and things, haven't come back. Right, there's swimming and swimming pools and leisure centres up and down this country is on the critical list, frankly, and they're borrowing money and selling assets and things just to be able to survive month to month at the moment. So access, I think, is the main thing. And either we say, let's take younger groups, either we say we're going to properly invest in physical education in schools, where the playing fields have increasingly been sold off, or the PE teachers are no longer prepared to spend their Saturdays putting on optional fixtures for kids because they have to run a second job too. Either we're prepared to really invest behind that and do that properly, or we say it's not in schools, but we need a step change in our local facilities. One way or another, we've just got to open up access. And there's a lot of good examples of places it's done well. So in the Netherlands, as we say in the book, they don't run sport and exercise through schools, but their local community clubs are open and open access from the minute school finishes to the end of the day, and people of all ages can go in and use those and have access to those. One way or another, we've got to let people who want to engage with sport more than in their front rooms.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions, particularly relating to women and sport. So one, using the example of Sarah Cox, who's paving the way for female referees in sport, who credits her community involvement in rugby with aiding her amazing career. Do you think communities, schools and universities, in the light of that, need to focus more on opening up paths for women in sport? Does that need to be a particular focus for, well, educational institutions, for example?
Well, why don't I take that from an explicitly capitalist perspective, and then let Kerry kind of take it from a sort of more, well, as a female, take it from a more how it feels to her in terms of the social and generational impact. So from a capitalist perspective, I don't know another industry that would so close itself off to 50% of its potential market. It is absolutely nuts that professional sports has spent the last 35, 40 years in it, which is really the infancy of professional sport, at least in the UK, curating sports for men, selling them to men, dressing them up for men, to the total lack of interest and engagement in being of any level of appealing to female sport. The under 2012 was a real sea change in that regard. There is a very, very, very small percentage of people in this country who'd ever seen a female football match before they saw Team GB play at London 2012. And a very small percentage of people who can remember, indeed, male gold medalists, to the extent they can remember someone like Jess Ennis at London 2012. Yeah. So it's a real step change. And there is a significant amount of time, effort, and energy needs to go into being properly compelling and attractive to female participants and viewers and ticket purchasers of sport going forward. And frankly, we've only just started to understand what's necessary in that regard. The 100 did an awful lot of work in terms of understanding what does it take for a woman rather than a man to buy a ticket for a sports event. What are the triggers for that to happen? And that was reflected in completely different marketing, completely different conversations they were trying to have with people about coming along to the event, and ultimately was the beginnings of a very different approach. They managed to pay the female professional athletes the same in terms of prize money, although not in terms of salary. And we've got a long way to go, but we're starting to move in the right direction commercially, and we have to. I mean, if we look at 2 World Cups, World Cup every 2 years, and all that debate around the Men's World Cup that's happened in the last few weeks. There's already a World Cup every 2 years, and every 2 years it's a male one, and every 2 years it's a female one. We've got to grow up a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like we are starting to move in the right direction, doesn't it? There was someone we interviewed in the book, I can't remember who the quote was from, but she was saying something about you can't just expect women to walk into their local rugby club and sign up to play rugby, you know, but so you've got to do things like send the rugby players into, I don't know, a nail bar or somewhere where women are, and you know, talk to them on, you know, on their level. And I think that's true, isn't it? It's just about kind of demystifying these things, and also what we were talking about, opening up that definition of sport. You know, there's loads of brilliant gyms and classes and all sorts of things out there. There's been a huge boom in women lifting weights. You know, there's a lot. That's, I mean, the weights, I do weights twice a week now. The weights area of my gym is somewhere I would never have set foot in 10 or 15 years ago, because it was full of enormous meat-headed men, and that's really changed, hasn't it? So I, you know, as someone who likes sport and exercise, I have seen those changes, but I think certainly schools, I think we need to think about what we're offering, as I mentioned, what we're offering teenage girls, and this whole idea of being sporty, you know, and that as a kind of adjective and as a badge of honour. You know, I wasn't sporty at school, but I found football at Cambridge because there was a broad range of things on offer, and it was something I loved. And I think if you get stuck with that label of not being sporty early on, it can be then difficult to get in, can't it? So, yeah. But I think as we sort of show in the book, there are positive steps forward. I think we'll get there.
You do identify all sorts of positive steps. I mean, and the book, having read it, I'm left feeling really quite optimistic about the future, and the future of sport, and the benefits of exercise. We are almost out of time, and I am going to finish with one final question, which brings it back to universities and schools, but particularly also in the light of the pandemic. So the question says, the university talks positively about encouraging students to participate in physical exercise and sport to support their mental and physical well-being. If we take it that students have had a very tough time over the last couple of years, what recommendations, ideas, or changes would you offer the institution, and it is Cambridge, but it could be wider, in support of rebooting them and their university experience? So really, what can the University of Cambridge learn from your insights? Matt, do you want to start?
Thanks for that. So I think I would point to what Sport England have learned actually about getting people back to healthier and more active habits. It's not enough just to build it and hope they will come. In particular, I love my running, and so for me to know parkrun was back, I was going to be there. But for 90% of the people in that race, they were probably feeling nervous about being back for the first time. They might have forgotten. They were out of the rhythm for sure, and they probably needed a little bit of help along the way. And so if you look at what Sport England's spending a lot of money on now, is they understand that to get people engaging back with sport or music or arts or whatever it is that makes up your university experience in its most complete form, actually sometimes, to Kerry's point, you need to go and hold their hand a little bit. You need to go and have a conversation with them where they are, and just remind them what it was special about those things, that those rituals that maybe they've forgotten about how to engage with. So parkrun, for example, when they now with Sport England's help, if they have people whose doctors are saying, look, you should really go and be more active, they don't just give them a prescription and hope they rock up to parkrun. They'll get a call from somebody at parkrun saying, look, I'm taking a group of people down who haven't been down there before, haven't been for a while. Do you want to join up? We're meeting outside the pub to half an hour beforehand. We'll have a wander down, have a natter, and just sort of try and soften it out a bit. And, you know, I know a few people who, have gone back to university. Maybe it's their first year this year after a year of being locked away, or maybe it's their second year, but their first year wasn't ideal. And I think those stories I've heard where they've settled quickly is where somebody's held their hand.
So it's providing that support and engaging with them where they are now.
Yeah, we've forgotten how to be in a leisure centre or how to not feel nervous in a changing room when you're in really tight area with 15 other people. And so just recognising that and going to spend some time with them. And I know Cambridge has got some fascinating and really laudable schemes that it's trying to work on at the moment in terms of just having some more outreach. It has some of the most, I've just have only good memories of facilities I was able to access at Cambridge because I played sports that did have traditional facilities. And there's such wonders there. It just needs somebody to go out there and hold people's hand.
Yeah.
Whether it's frisbee or it's football.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. Regardless of the sport, game, whatever. Yeah. Kerry, any thoughts from you as to what we need to do in the light of the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, because I know we're out of time, aren't we? But I think it's, you know, it's that emphasizing to people that it's not just about physical health, what your body looks like, that, you know, obviously that's part of it. You can get stronger, but it's the social aspect, isn't it? It's making friends, it's connecting with people, and it's also continuing to join the dots between physical activity and mental health as well, which is obviously something that younger people are very concerned about. And you know, it's the meditative quality of sport as well, isn't it? And activity, which is really important. I think that all those things need to be emphasized.
If you look at if you look at parkrun will never put a parkrun where there isn't a cafe. It's because the race is incidental, the run is accidental. It's about the social community you're building, and that ultimately is the lesson for a uni, I think.
And that's what has been lost with lockdown and pandemic, and we really want to bring that back. Thank you. That is a really good note on which to stop. We are out of time. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer all the questions. Matt and Kerry, I would love to be able to continue to talk to you about your book or your incredible insights. I really do commend All to Play For to everybody who's been watching. And I hope you join me in thanking Matt and Kerry for joining us this evening. And thank you everybody who's been listening. Thank you for the questions, and good night. Goodbye.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.